You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I'm your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Sexuality is lifelong. There's no specific age at which people stop being sexual, but our sexuality is something that evolves and changes over time. And those changes are something that we're not always prepared for. For those of us who were lucky enough to get any sex ed, it mostly focused on what we needed to know as teenagers, not what we were going to need to know as adults. So in today's show, we're going to talk about how to stay sexually healthy for your entire life. We're going to explore what people at different stages of life need to know about sex, including younger, midlife, and older adults. We'll also talk about why staying sexually healthy is so important, tips for maintaining a healthy sex life when desire declines or disappears, and how we can make it easier to talk about sexual health issues with our doctors so that we can get the sexual health care that we need. This is crucial because a lot of patients feel hesitant to bring up sex in the doctor's office, and a lot of physicians are reluctant to bring up the topic of sex out of fear that they'll embarrass or offend their patients. The end result of all of this is that sexual health issues often get ignored. I am joined once again by Dr. Eveline Dacker, who is the creator of the STARS framework for sexual communication, which we discussed in depth in the last episode. She is a physician who specializes in sexual wellness, menopause and hormones, and vitality throughout life. Her unique approach to health incorporates pleasure as an important aspect for healing trauma and illness. This is going to be another fascinating and very practical conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you ever find yourself dreaming about a career where you get to talk about sex and psychology all day long? What if I told you there's a place that can connect you with world-class experts and has a large, thriving community? Sexual Health Alliance does just that. Sexual Health Alliance helps you to build the career of your dreams and is at the forefront of sexuality education. Students come from all parts of the world and from all types of backgrounds. Whether you're in school just starting out on your journey or building advanced skills in your profession, Sexual Health Alliance's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online education will move you beyond the basics and set you up to become sexceptional. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. And let them know that you heard about Sexual Health Alliance on this podcast. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Okay, Eveline, let's talk about how to stay sexually healthy for your entire life. And let's start by talking about what people at different stages of life might need to know in terms of maintaining their sexual health, because specific concerns and overall health are going to be different for people at different points in time. So we'll start by talking about younger adults. And to me, I think an important piece of advice for young adults is to learn to be sexually adaptable and flexible, because our sex lives are going to change over the course of time. What we're physically capable of, what feels pleasurable to us, these things are going to change at some point. And so the more that we learn early on that sex isn't just one thing and that there are multiple ways to experience pleasure, the better we'll be able to adapt when circumstances change. So what do you think? What are some other things that young adults need to know in terms of staying sexually healthy?
STI testing. Young adults have the highest risk for gonorrhea and chlamydia. And this is in both homosexual, heterosexual. But in young adults, especially young adults that have cervixes and vaginas, the risk of chlamydia is much higher because it doesn't show up. There's no signs of chlamydia. And therefore, without regular testing, you may miss it until it becomes a really bad infection. So young adults to stay sexually healthy really is screening. We forget that screening people with penises is also important, but it is. So I really strongly recommend screening for STIs between partners is an important way of staying healthy. The second thing that I think is really important is recognizing that the things we think are showing turn-ons is not always the case, like a erect penis or a lubricated vagina. We think like when you're young, you should have both of those. And if that's not happening, something is wrong with you. And that's not necessarily the case. Some people need a little extra help in either direction. I also want to mention the role of pornography. Unfortunately, most people are getting their sex education through pornography because we're so limited in what we can teach in schools. And so people are learning it from each other and they're learning it from porn. And I have to remind people often that that is not true sex. Like true sex happens in different ways. It's not as pretty. It's not as exciting sometimes. And yet it's still okay. And so that's for young adults. And of course, if you're having sex that could actually lead to a pregnancy, it's important to have those conversations early. And also think about what would happen if a pregnancy was to occur. We cannot take that both people are going to want the same outcome. So those are important factors to have conversations around.
Yeah, I think those are absolutely very important. And, just to add a couple of things to it, when it comes to STIs and why it's important to get tested, even if you're not showing symptoms, is that the single most common symptom of having an STI is having no symptoms, right? And so you might think that you don't have anything, but you might very well be carrying some type of infection that just happens to be asymptomatic. And the problem with some of those asymptomatic infections is that if they're not treated, over time, they can lead to more serious and severe health problems like the development of pelvic inflammatory disease. So it's important if you're sexually active that you're getting tested with some regularity. And, just because you're monogamous doesn't mean that you're safe from STIs, because sometimes people cheat. And, oftentimes with monogamy, people are jumping from one monogamous relationship to another. They're practicing what we call serial monogamy, and they're not getting tested in between. And so that's also creating opportunities for infections to spread. So yeah, I think those are really great points about the importance of STI testing, and also the point that you made about how our bodies won't always do what we want them to do, right? These are what I like to call sexual disappointments, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a sexual dysfunction. It's just sometimes our bodies don't always respond or react the way that we want them to in a given moment. And that's perfectly normal. If the penis doesn't get erect or if the vagina isn't lubricated, like these things happen from time to time. It's only when they become a persistent pattern of behavior that we're starting to talk about a potential sexual dysfunction that has developed.
Yeah, I just want to mention one more thing for young adults that I find is very important is to get immunized against human papillomavirus, HPV, because we don't really start testing for HPV until a person with a cervix is over 30 years old. And we never test people with penises because there is no available test. So everybody getting vaccinated against HPV is the only vaccine that helps prevent cancer. So I want to just name that.
Yep. I'm a big advocate for the HPV vaccine as well. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So let's talk about midlife. This is a period of time when, for many people, sexual problems begin to arise for the first time. For example, women in perimenopause or the early stages of menopause might start to experience some new sexual difficulties, such as vaginal pain or dryness. Likewise, for men, this is a time when rates of erectile dysfunction really start to rise. And developing a new sexual difficulty is something that a lot of folks really struggle to deal with, and they don't know how to discuss with their partners. And in my research, I actually see that a lot of people just start avoiding sex entirely when a difficulty emerges because they're too embarrassed or ashamed to talk about it with their partner. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about tips for what to do when sexual difficulties start to emerge and how we can communicate about them effectively with our partners.
Yes, I think, I'm really excited how there's so much conversation now around perimenopause and menopause, how it's finally coming out of the shadows, because it really gives us an understanding and a framework to have these conversations with. Before, it was quite lonely. It's like, oh my gosh, the story around these transitions, especially for people who are estrogen dominant, who are going through this transition, is that, oh my God, I'm going to lose my sexuality. I'm going to have problems. There's nothing I could do. I just have to recognize that I'm going to go from this kind of sexual being to like zero. And that is really terrifying. And now we realize that that's not true. That's a story. Things do change, but it doesn't mean they change for the worse. One of the things with people with penises who start having less testosterone, and testosterone levels can decrease. They don't decrease as radically as estrogen levels, but they may decrease, as well as, erections definitely change as a person gets older. But we've had medications for that for like over 20 years. So those medications make it so those conversations with people with penises that they don't have to have that. They don't have to be like, oh my gosh, I have a problem, because they just pop a pill and nobody has to know better. But with people with vaginas, as our estrogen starts dropping, our lubrication starts dropping, and then the tissue starts changing, and it could become more uncomfortable. So one of the biggest things is to know that there are solutions for that. We don't have to just put up with it. It's not something that we're going to go, we have to be natural. So we have to like avoid anything. And I think that another big issue is that a lot of doctors feel really uncomfortable bringing it up and talking about it. So then where's the conversation starting? Is it starting with a person coming to see me and being like, I'm having pain? You know what? It rarely comes up unless I begin the conversation. And it's like, are you having pleasure? Are you having pleasure with sex? And people can have pleasure and they don't have to have penetration. But if you're not having pleasure, where are you having discomfort? If somebody's like, you know what, I really don't want to go into the whole medical system and take hormones and take pills and do that, it doesn't mean that you still have to put up with it. There's so much natural substances that one can use to help some of those transitions. I'm not going to go into that, but like, you're not alone if you don't want to use any medications or pharmaceuticals. There's still things out there. And understand that your providers haven't been trained to have these conversations. We are human too, and we have a lot of our unconscious biases and our own baggage around sexuality that oftentimes when I talk to providers, I'm like, why aren't you talking about sex? They're like, oh my God, I don't want to offend my patients. And it's like, wow, talking about sex may be offending. That concept in itself, like, we got to change that, because again, sexual health is whole person health. When we are sexually healthy, when we are in our bodies, we're going to understand that we get pleasure from these beautiful things that carry us, and that not everything is in our heads. Sexuality doesn't exist just here. So normalizing these conversations, and I'm sorry if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, damn it, I'm the one who has to bring it up to my provider. Yes, I'm sorry, but this is how we all change the world. Like, it's going to take all of us to do it together. And bringing it up that there's these changes in your body that you're noticing, because they can be clues to something else going on.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point about, when it comes to sexual difficulties, on the one hand, there's the conversation that you might have with your partner about it, but there's also the conversation that you might have with a doctor. And there often is this reluctance on both sides of the table in a physician's office to talk about sex at all. As you mentioned, lots of doctors don't get much, if any, training in terms of how to talk about these issues. They're worried about upsetting or offending their patients by talking about it. So doctors often don't bring it up, but then patients are like, I don't know how to bring this up, or I'm too embarrassed or nervous or uncomfortable. And so, the unfortunate reality is that a lot of sexual problems and difficulties don't get addressed or treated, and then people suffer in silence for years. And so it is very important for patients to feel empowered to bring up their sexual health issues and concerns with their provider. And if their provider isn't able to address it or treat it, maybe because they don't have the training, they can refer you out to somebody else who should be able to help you with that particular problem. So just because your primary doctor might not be able to help doesn't mean that there isn't somebody else out there who might be able to help with the problem that you're experiencing.
Absolutely. And, another thing is medications. Medications can cause sexual dysfunction as well. Even medications that you don't think about. Oral contraceptive pills, estrogen containing oral contraceptive pills could lead some women to have severe pain in their vulva. And like, we don't talk about that. Antidepressants. We use antidepressants sometimes for hot flashes, but then we don't realize that those antidepressants can actually worsen sexual dysfunction. So there really has to be a much broader understanding within healthcare and healthcare providers to also recognize that sexuality is important. And it's not just important for orgasms, but it's actually important for relationships. And it's important for our bodies, it's important for our relationships, and therefore it should be part of the things that we discuss with our patients. For example, I have somebody who is going through bladder cancer surgery, and I know this person is a very sexually active person. And I said to them, have you talked to your provider about how this is going to affect you sexually? Because you're going to be having stuff put into your bladder, and then that could affect what comes out of your urethra. How is that going to affect you? And they're like, oh my God, my urologist didn't even talk about it. Didn't even talk about it. Didn't even talk about what I'm going to need or what that's going to mean. And I'm like, please bring it up to your urologist. Somebody going through hip replacement surgery or, orthopedics. I'm like, talk to your doctor how that's going to relate to your sexuality, because they don't think about it. And that's something that I think needs to change in healthcare. And that's part of the work I do with the STARS Talk, is not only bring it up in terms of what we talk about with each other, but how doctors have to think about this with their patients.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And we talked about that previously on the show when I interviewed Dr. Evan Goldstein, who's an anal surgeon. And, lots of people need to have anal surgeries performed for various reasons, whether they have tears or fissures or hemorrhoids or other things like that. And lots of colorectal surgeons will perform their surgery in a way that's designed to optimize for bowel function without giving any consideration to the fact that some people might be using their anus for sexual purposes. And, the way you might perform that surgery might be very different, if somebody is a person who enjoys receptive anal intercourse, right? So it's something where with a lot of pelvic surgeries, doctors do need to inform patients up front about potential side effects. Patients should ask about potential sexual side effects so that you can tailor the treatment plan to meet the individual where they are and address their needs. Because all too often it happens that somebody goes in for a surgery and they just didn't realize that there were going to be sexual side effects from it because their doctor didn't tell them. And now it's much harder to address after that surgery's been performed. So yeah, I appreciate the work that you're doing in this area to try and make people more aware of these conversations, because absolutely, these are things that we need to be talking more about.
And as we go, I'm going to be specifically right now talking about people who are going through the menopause transition, who are estrogen dominant, and how that affects our anatomy, because it does affect our anatomy. When we lose that estrogen, when it starts really going down, it does affect the tissue of the vulva, the urethra, and the vaginal canal. And it affects it because those tissues are very hormonally driven. And when the hormones aren't there, it's like our bodies are like, oh, we don't need you anymore. Because again, I want to remind everybody that we're animals, and animals are kind of put on this planet to survive and reproduce. And so when we're no longer needing to reproduce and that hormone goes down, then sometimes those tissues start shrinking and changing. And 40% of our lifetime of a person who goes through menopause, 40% of the lifetime actually exists after menopause. So we don't die, when we stop being reproductive. So how do we maintain our sexuality through those changes? And there's two options. There's the hormonal option, which is what I often recommend people use estrogen cream in their canal, even if they don't want to take it systemically. It could help maintain the health of your vaginal canal, your urethra, and your vulva. But for people who are not wanting to do that, It's not necessary. But we have to understand that sexuality could change. And it doesn't mean it's a bad thing if you don't want to have any penetration in those areas anymore. There's other places that one can have pleasure. Pleasure does not exist only in the genitals. Our entire body is a pleasure organ. Our entire body, our skin, our head, our hair. You could use hands, you could use toys, you could use play and imagination. And sometimes when we go through these changes, and if, let's say, there's a heterosexual couple where he may be having issues with getting erect and she may be having issues with her vagina, I sometimes think of it as like, oh my God, what a beautiful time to explore how great sexuality can be without just falling to penetration and orgasm. What a beautiful way of understanding that you can use your entire body for pleasure. And I really help those people understand what I had learned through more neo-tantra, like breath, movement, sound, slowing down, using touch, using eye gaze. Like, it could be such a beautiful way of expanding our sexual than having it go shrink down. So I love just reminding people that it's not just about the things we're taught. There's other ways of like exploring, genitals and mouths and anuses. I mean, there's so many other things that we can do versus just like the things that we're taught in high school, what sex means or what it is.
Yeah, and I think that is the single most important piece of sex advice for older adults, which is to shift or change your definition of sex. And what we see in the research is that for older adults who continue to define sex as penetration, they tend to experience steeper declines in sexual satisfaction and experience more sexual problems and difficulties. By contrast, for those who adopt more expansive definitions of sex and see sex as intimacy, which can encompass a wide range of activities that you can do together that can bring everyone pleasure, they tend to experience much higher levels of sexual satisfaction over time. So yeah, having that adaptability, changing that definition of sex and communicating about your needs they're important, I think, at any stage of life, but I think they become especially important in older age as some of these problems start to arise because, the single biggest complaint we hear from seniors when it comes to sex is that the old ways don't work anymore. And well, what that means is that it's time to find some new ways, right? And the more openness you have to exploring new avenues for pleasure, all the better for everyone.
And I also want to address that, like, staying healthy, doing the things that keep us healthy and vital really go a long way with being sexual. So what I mean by that is eating a healthy diet, make sure that you do aerobic exercise, make sure that you still strength train, try your best to get a good night's sleep. Take care of your entire body and it will show up in how well you function sexually. I have a patient who, they're both my patients, this couple, a heterosexual couple, and he is 83 and she's 79. And talking to them individually, she was like, damn, we definitely have slowed down in our sex. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? She's like, yeah, we're only having sex about 4 to 5 times a week now. And I'm talking about intercourse, penetration. And I'm just like, wow. So, that's slowing down for them. And they're both really healthy. They both like exercise and take care of their bodies. And so I'm like, yeah, it doesn't mean that things are going to end.
Yeah, and it is a really important point that there is no definitive endpoint to our sex lives. People, for as long as they're alive, are capable of having sex and having pleasurable sex. And, there is often this assumption that older adults just stop having sex at some point. And I know people don't like to think about their parents or grandparents having sex, but that the reality of it is that people maintain their sexuality through older age. We need to normalize that. And it's important for us to talk about too, because we know, for example, that there have been a lot of media reports recently about outbreaks of STIs in nursing homes. And so, we also need to have these sexual health conversations for seniors as well, because oftentimes they're not using any type of protection because the concerns of unintended pregnancy are taken out of the equation, but there's still that concern about STI transmission. And so condoms are still important. Safer sex practices are still important for people at any stage of the lifespan. And it's important for us to normalize that and talk about it so that we give people the sex ed that they need. And, it's really unfortunate that the only formal sex ed that most people ever get happens when you're an early teenager and they don't teach you everything that you need to know, that you're going to want to know as you progress through your life. And the reality is that, we kind of need like regular refresher courses with sex ed, because what we need to know at a given point in time is going to keep changing.
And we're not taught comprehensive sex education. And I think the biggest thing that's missing in our sex education is relationships. And the concept, I'm going to just like put it in quotes, queer sex has so much lessons in it. How we can have sex in ways that are not just heterosexual penetration or penetration in any way, but that sex is so much more expansive. So the idea of continuing that conversations and continuing to show that things could grow and change. Honestly, when I was in my 40s, I thought that like when I was in my 60s, I wouldn't like sex and I wouldn't, or 50s, like it was all downhill. And that's what I just had to accept. And personally, for me and for a lot of women that I know, our sexuality just got better in our 50s. Mm-hmm. It got better, and it's just so much more accessible and alive. Those stories of things dying and not being there is just really a story that we have in our culture because we haven't been taught comprehensive sex education.
Yeah, and I think that's so true that a lot of people think that, their sex life is going to be over when they hit 40, no matter what their gender is. And that, the best sex that they're going to have is when they're in their 20s or when they're in college. And it's like, no, it actually does get better. And in fact, it gets way better over time, right? So you're not alone in that experience of sex getting better with age. And I think that is like a refreshing, reassuring message for a lot of people to know that there's still stuff to look forward to. But something else I wanted to ask you about is that, when it comes to this issue of sex and aging and staying sexually healthy, a problem that arises for many people is that, they are in a relationship with someone and either they or their partner experience a decline in sexual desire, or sexual desire disappears. And then this leads to a sexual desire discrepancy. And so I wanted to ask you if you had any tips or advice that you could share for people in relationships where one partner has lost desire. How do you maintain sexual health in relationships where desire has disappeared?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is if desire disappears, it's really important to reach out to your healthcare provider and talk about it because there may be other things that's causing that. I recently had a patient, and unfortunately, he didn't reveal to me that his sexual desire was decreased. And he came to me because of some vision changes, and we found a tumor in his pituitary. And if he had told me that his sexual desire had been decreasing earlier on, I would have started doing hormone levels and checks to see what was going on. And I may have found that tumor way before it affected his vision. So it is really important if you notice a decline in your sexuality, whatever gender you are, and it's like, whoa, what is going on? That actually could be a symptom of something important. On the other hand, it could be a symptom of a dysfunction in a relationship. And sometimes our body tells us things that we don't want to know. Our bodies tells us that we're not safe in that relationship. And so then when our desire is down and but we're in denial about that. So oftentimes, if there's a discrepancy, if all of a sudden a desire goes away, I think there could be a physiological underlying pinning for it, or it could be a relational underpinning. And both of those things need to be addressed. Sometimes one partner may not be taking care of themselves the way another partner, sometimes I have patients who they're running and lifting weights and doing all these things and eating healthy, and their partner is watching TV or on a computer doing whatever. And then the desire changes. Now, is that because one person's taking care of themselves and the other person isn't, and that's a relationship issue? So there's many reasons for it. And sometimes, when there's a discrepancy in desire, that could mean that there's an underlying relationship issue that can or cannot be fixed.
Yeah, desire issues are definitely complex. And, that's one of the reasons why I think desire is one of the hardest issues to treat when you've got these big desire discrepancies or when somebody loses desire, is that there could be so many different things that are factoring into it. And I really appreciate the point about, getting tested or screened by your physician and being open about this, because it could be the sign of an underlying health issue. And that can be true for almost any sexual dysfunction. Erectile dysfunction can be an early warning sign of cardiovascular disease. And so it is so important for patients to talk to their doctors about sexual health issues they're experiencing, because your sexual health is connected to your overall health. And, these things can be feeding into one another. So absolutely just another reason why it's so important to talk about these things.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting because the person who told me about the desire was actually their partner, who mentioned to me that they were having issues. They're like, what's going on? Their desire. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's that pituitary tumor, so it was just like, wow. And a reminder to me, as well as other healthcare providers, how important it is to ask those questions regardless of the gender of the person.
What's a good question that a healthcare provider could ask a patient, to just sort of open up that conversation and let them know that it's safe to talk about your sexual concerns?
I often address it by asking about pleasure. Are you having pleasure in your life? How is pleasure in your body? Are you experiencing pleasure in your body? How is your intimate connections? How are you feeling intimately connected within yourself? And after all those questions, I often ask about self-pleasure. Has there been any changes in your self-pleasure practices? I try not to use words like masturbation or desire or sex, because they're so loaded and there's so much stigma associated with those words that it makes it hard for people to talk about. But when I talk about pleasure and self-pleasure and enjoyment, it's a lot easier for people to open up.
Yeah, it makes sense to me, because a lot of people just struggle in general when talking about any of these issues, but sometimes having that euphemism or some other way of talking about it can make it a little easier to open the door and get those conversations started. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Eveline. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
You could go to my website, EvelineDacker.com. There's a STARS website that's about my sexual communication model, which is MakeTimeForTheTalk.com. You could find me on Facebook with just my name, Eveline Dacker, and you could find me on Instagram at SexMedDoc.
Well, great. I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Yes, thank you for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sexandpsychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.